pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
How many people saw it on Facebook?
What, about Maryland?
Public notice.
Oh, yeah, how many people saw my notice on, I did it on We Love Baldwinsville? You saw it there? Okay. I just put it on Facebook and then I put it on We Love Baldwinsville and it was in the Messenger and in Hebrews North. So I try to get that out ahead of time and get it in by the deadlines. Okay?
Thank you, Bob, for taping.
Yes, and yeah, thank you, Bob, for taping, and thank you, Steve, for doing the program, Baldwin Home for Indigent Gentlewomen, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the talk. Okay?
Yeah, thanks to Bob for taping these. If you miss them in the future, they're uploaded to the PAC-B website, and they go to YouTube from there, and so you can look at anything you've missed. You know, I want to reach out to some people tonight that came, some of my buddies. These are folks that I've known since high school and Boy Scouts, and they're still speaking to me, which is amazing. So there's an entire row back there that's filled of friends of mine, and I'm just glad that they were all able to make it. And I see a lot of other familiar faces here, too. I appreciate everybody coming. Folks from McCary's Legacy, folks from the Beauchamp Historical Club. I'm going to do what I did last time and kind of shamelessly promote both the Beauchamp Club and McCary's Legacy. I'm doing 4 programs. This is the second in a series of 4. So I'm going to pass these out. I don't know if there are enough to go around, but you can see the other 2 that are remaining. I believe there's one on March 10th, right? And then May something or other. You'll see it on there. But if you could take one and pass it on, and you can see the kinds of programs that we've got coming up. March 10th and May 12th. Thank you. There's some more seats up here, Tim. There's 3 right up here. And I put on fresh deodorant about an hour ago, so we're in good shape. So actually, if you take away the row of friends and my brother and my nieces and my mom and the people from McCary Town, there would be 3 of us here right now. But I see Lynn Pintos here, Town of Van Buren historian. Thank you. To everybody for coming. The ground rules are, who was here last time for the last talk? And you came back. That's amazing. You returned to the scene of the crime. The ground rules are the same. So this can get pretty dry, and I can get pretty hoarse. So please ask questions throughout or make comments if you know about something that I didn't pick up. I also, before I get into that, I wanted to pass out, again, if you're not familiar with McCary's Legacy, which is distinctly different from Beauchamp Historical Club, I have 1 copy of the newsletter. I'd love to get it back. It's from the holidays. It kind of gives you an idea of if you join McCary's Legacy, which is different. We have a bit of a different focus from Beauchamp Historical Club, but still oriented around history. I'll pass that around too, and if you're so inclined, you can look into joining that. We're the ones that own and operate Shacksboro Museum. Okay. I want to thank some past local historians. I did this last time. Leslie Voorhees has done extensive genealogical work and local history work that's contributed a lot to what I've done and others have done, including mapping out every single cemetery in the town of Lysander and Van Buren and all the burials through, I want to say, the 40s at some point. Pearl Palmer wrote a series in the 40s about Baldwinsville. And I still go back and refer to that a lot. Tony Christopher wrote a similar column in the 60s and 70s that was extraordinary. I've added someone to the group here. That's George Hawley IV. Hawley, probably a lot of you know, Hawley is a name that goes way back in Baldwinsville. Obviously, he's the 4th, so there were 3 others that came before him. And he was a historian, and I relied heavily on him for this story. If you don't have it, it's out of print. There are copies in the library. This is mine. Don't take it. But anyway.
It's available for circulation, too.
Circulation.
I mean, it's in local history, but it's in...
So you don't have to steal it. You can actually get it out of the library. It's you know, the story of Jonas and Betsy and their family, and he goes into infinite detail. But also, this is where I picked up this story about kind of this strange branch of the family that moved to Texas and stuff happened. And I looked at it, I said, there's a story in here somewhere. I really like to focus on the obscure. This is called Dr. Jonas C. and Mrs. Betsy Baldwin, founders of Baldwinsville, New York, and some of their descendants.
Dr. Jonas C.
Yep.
Letter C or S-E-E or what?
C as in Cutler. Sue.
Two things. Are these people all village historians? Not affiliated with one of the townships?
Well, I could be corrected by Bonnie, and I'm sure I will, but
Well, I was wondering about.
Tony Christopher was a Van Buren Town historian. He had that official capacity. Not sure. George Hawley was Lysander Town historian. I know that for a fact.
There was Bob Nostrand.
Right.
He was Lysander, I believe.
Yep. And so he's written some things that I'll refer to in the future. These are the four that I've kind of been going to. Okay. These are the four I've been going to.
One thing to add on the library, if you've got a pencil, the call number basically for Baldwinsville, North Machine Works is different and before this works is different, but basically Baldwinsville is 974.765, and they're located behind the reference desk on that lower shelf.
One other thing about books. At the Shakespeare Museum, we do have a selection of books on local history. We have some books that are for sale, but we have a bookcase that has a whole lot of books, and they're Beeville related, Syracuse related, and they are available to look at in the museum. You can't take them out, but anyone is welcome to come in during museum hours and look at anything that we have in the bookcase there.
So one other book I'm going to refer to, because I borrow from it a lot. I don't think Sue's here tonight. Greater Baldwinsville, some great photographs in here. Spans the whole history of the village going way back. And you can pick that up at the Shakespeare Museum and lots of other places as well. And it's also in the library. So I do want to, I'm going to keep doing this because if it weren't for Bonnie and Sue, I think history would have kind of died out in this town. So I'm going to make you do it. I'd like to give Bonnie a round of applause and Sue an absentia. Because without them, I think it'd be difficult to even pursue projects like this. There's some other folks I want to refer to. A lot of this story takes place outside of Baldwinsville, which is outside of my comfort zone. So I contacted some people in Houston and Wisconsin where things happened and got some information. So people like Betty Trapp Chapman, Melissa Keene and Rebecca Russell, all down in Houston in different capacities. A guy named Lee Grady out in Wisconsin. A guy named William Goodman, Esquire, who was my legal advisor, because there's a lot of legal documents in this case. And then a guy named David Weaver, who lives here in the village, who gave me some really good information about where some of the Baldwins lived early on. So these folks helped out a lot. So I know they're not here tonight, but they may be watching. Like I said, there's 4 stories in this series. They're all kind of obscure. I tried to pick stories that haven't been written about in the past. The last one was about spiritualism here in Beeville. This one's about a home that never got built for a lot of reasons, but could have fundamentally, I think, changed the character of the community. And it has a lot of stuff going on in it that can be very complicated and convoluted. But had it not been for some minor legal technicalities, I think this community could be a very different place today. The next one in March, Last Man to Leave Picketville, is a very, very interesting story. It's got a little bit about Beaver Lake in it, a little bit about sawmills. There were once 7 sawmills that dotted the outlet from Beaver Lake all the way to Ox Creek. And this is the story about one little community that is gone, right? It disappeared about 50 years ago and has never reappeared. There was a thriving community. It's completely gone. There's nothing left. And then in May, that title's a little deceiving. We have a lot of carp in the area. There's a carp tournament. But how did they get here, right? They're not indigenous. They're an invasive species. They had to get introduced at some point. I went back and researched it for a newspaper article 10 years ago and found that it's kind of an interesting story, and like most things, it had unintended consequences. So there are a lot of carp here, but not necessarily for the reasons you might think. All these stories are based on a couple of newspaper series I wrote in the Messenger about 10 years ago. One called Looking Backward and the other one called Pieces of the Past. They were 500-word essays. Clearly, this has gone a little bit above and beyond that, so I've tried to really dig in and find out some of the details and fill in some of the more interesting gaps. Again, for me, the more eccentric, the more obscure, the more bizarre, the better. If nothing else than to hold your attention so you don't just all go back to the refreshment table. But so this is, you know, everybody says local history's so boring, and I found this paragraph in George Hawley's book, and it's got a story about forged documents and contested wills, mysterious deaths, lost fortunes, life in the Wild West, foreign wars, an eccentric millionaire, and a murder plot. Basically stuff you read about in the Messenger every week, right? It's just run-of-the-mill Beeville stuff happens every week. And I said, this can't be possible that this actually has a connection to Baldwinsville. Not only has a connection to Baldwinsville, but according to more than one source, if it hadn't been for a Baldwinsville native, a Baldwin granddaughter, who got involved and married a man from Texas, this stuff probably wouldn't have happened. Well, probably not the war. The war would have happened anyway. So it's kind of an interesting story. I'll try to do my best to simplify it in however long we have, but it does have a lot of detail involved in it. Again, weigh in if you think you know something. In each of these, I try to investigate. Like I said last time, I'm fascinated by what life must have been like 150, 200 years ago in this community and beyond. What was it like to live before the things that we take for granted today? All the technology, all the commerce, all the industry, all the transportation, everything. What was it like to live in this country and in this community 200 years ago? So who was this woman? Her name was Julia Elizabeth Baldwin Rice. She was a Baldwin granddaughter of Jonas and Betsy Baldwin, our founders, went by Libby. She left a legacy to Baldwinsville that I don't think anybody really knows much about. It was very considerable if you consider $8 million in today's money considerable. She left that money to the village about 120 years ago, and it never came to fruition, but it was in her will. So what happened to prevent it from coming to fruition? And that's another part of the story that's kind of interesting. Unfortunately, if you get involved in local history, you have to do some genealogy. I know this is like watching paint dry for a lot of people, but just as a reminder, our founders are Jonas and Betsy Baldwin. They had 7 kids: Eliza, Stephen, Harvey, Harriet, Horace, Ephraim, and Charlotte. This story is going to focus on the 5th and the 7th. These are the Texas Baldwins from Hawley's book. So if you hear about this branch of Baldwins that emigrated to Texas, these would be they. Not much is written about them because not much was known about them. Once they disappeared, we're talking in the 1830s, not much was heard later on. So usually I go to my go-to source, which is FultonHistory.com, every newspaper in the area back to 1850, basically, and I can find out what I need to know, supplemented by books like these. In this case, I had to go to the Texas Archives, Rice Institute Archives, now Rice University. I had to go to the Texas Portal and places like that to pull up newspaper stories from down there and hear what they were talking about, which at the time, Texas was a foreign country, right? It wasn't even a state yet. Little bit about the Baldwin legacy. You know, we're Baldwinsville. We were founded by Baldwins. There's not much left really to remind people who they were and what they did. And Hawley makes this point in his book. You got to look far and wide in this community to find remnants or vestiges of what they did while they were here. Now clearly there's the canal. On the left you can see the east end of it by Lock Street where one of the locks was. On the right, you can see the canal looking west, and you can see in the distance the spire of the Methodist Church. And over here, that's the clock tower of the Seneca Hotel, which was on the northwest corner of Genesee and Oswego. I made a mistake in my last presentation. I said the third of the 3 Seneca hotels burned turn of the century. It didn't burn until 1935. And here's an interesting tidbit. Who was the only person killed when the last Seneca Hotel burned on December 31st, 1935? Bonnie? Have a pecan sandy. The last remaining Baldwin in Baldwinsville descended from Jonas and Betsy, died in that fire. He was the only victim of that fire in 1935. So that's the other thing, is that we think of Baldwinsville as being founded and inhabited by Baldwins, but the last Baldwin passed away here, what's that, 180 years ago, 175, whatever it is. No, not quite that much, 85 years ago. My math isn't so good. Another remnant, and I really didn't know this, but how many of you remember Mercer Milling? Right? Yeah, I'm sure you did. When I was a kid and I had a guinea pig for a pet, this is where I went to get the feed for the guinea pig, and it looked a heck of a lot like this down here. Thanks to Mary Ann Miles. If you don't have her series of photographs about town, there go my cookies. You might want to think about it. She's got a great series of photographs of historical landmarks in Baldwinsville. Now the Red Mill Inn, that was an operating mill, I think as of 1827 is when it was built. And some would say, I think, and I would agree with them, it is the most historic landmark in the village of Baldwinsville. Most of it's still standing. It's been renovated, but it goes back to 1825, 1830, somewhere in that neighborhood. It's probably the oldest building that we have that's still standing. This is another interesting thing. This is a map circa 1850. George Robinson was an early inhabitant who was a surveyor, and he worked for the Baldwins, and he laid out most of the map of the early village of Baldwinsville. And all that stuff in blue was owned by the Baldwin estate. Okay, so Jonas and Betsy, I was told, and I've read, that this was the original homestead up here. Well, there was a log cabin down here near Charlotte Street. This was the original homestead, cleared all the way down to the river. Was basically a rolling field or lawn with trees lining it. So you could stand on the porch in the Baldwin house almost to Oneida Street and see the river down below at one time. A pretty impressive scene, and that's why Betsy Baldwin wanted to stop here and stay here. She thought the vistas were incredible between the river and the forests. Bonnie?
Do you know that the house still exists?
It does not, but pieces of it do.
It does. In two parks on East Oneida, if you go out the Assembly of God parking lot
Right.
towards Oneida towards Swiggle Street, those first two houses are that house.
That's true. In many cases, they took apart old houses and used them to construct new houses. And you're right, I think it's 6 and 8 Oneida Street are pieces of the old Baldwin house. So if you drive by there, you can see what pieces of it might have looked like.
In the map, is that the canal going and making an island?
This is the Baldwin Canal here,
Uh-huh.
okay, over to Lock Street, and there was a lock there, and the dam was here.
That was built by locally, that wasn't part of the Erie Canal?
No. So, and that's important because this canal was authorized and built around 1809. And the Baldwins had a lock, no pun intended, on river transportation for the Seneca between Onondaga Lake, basically all the way to Montezuma. They had a lock on the river. This was the only place where you could cross the rapids through a canal. They got a license from the state to build a canal. Jonas Baldwin worked for the Inland Navigation Company, whose job it was to create canals. I don't know if this is true. You can help me out with this one. I heard it was the first canal to be built west of Albany, a locking canal. No.
He was working at Little Falls.
Right, Little Falls, and then he moved. Right. But the other two things to note on here that I think are, so first of all, Baldwin's owned, even by 1850, the vast majority of the property north of the river, right? So they had enormous land holdings. They weren't necessarily that valuable, but they controlled a lot of land. Two of those pieces of land, if you know where the corner of Charlotte and North is down across from Mercer Park, there was one structure there other than the Methodist Church, really, and it was called the Castle. All right, and that's where Charlotte Baldwin, one of the daughters, lived with her husband. It was an enormous house with a wraparound porch, beautiful view of the river. That's another house, to Bonnie's point, that was taken apart and created some of the other houses in this area. Up and down North and along West Genesee Street, I think it was disassembled. Up here was another Baldwin son, Horace. That house is no longer there. But if you think about the old Isaac Baldwin house, the beautiful brick house at 15 Elizabeth Street, that's right across the street. So these two factor heavily because Charlotte and her husband and Horace and his wife are the ones that emigrated to Texas. And think about it for a second. We're talking 1830s. Yeah, to go to Texas, which wasn't even a state, which at the time was still part of Mexico, and they were going through a revolution. It hadn't been that long since the Alamo, and they picked up and went to Mexico. So why did they do that if the Baldwins had so much land around Baldwinsville? One thing was already mentioned. The Erie Canal was put in 1825. It didn't go through Baldwinsville, right? If you wanted to go west, you had to go down the Seneca River and through the lock and around the rapids. Once the Erie Canal was put in, it completely bypassed Baldwinsville. That had a significant impact on commerce and industry. In Baldwinsville, property values declined after that as well. So it just wasn't as much of a place. The other thing was the Baldwins were very prolific parents, and their children were prolific parents, and they had prodigious numbers of children and grandchildren. So when you've got 35 Baldwin grandchildren, even though you've got all that land, and the land always goes to the sons, then there wasn't a whole lot for some people to do, especially for the women. And so in the case of Charlotte, she married a guy named Augustus Allen, who went down and bought land in Texas, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So this is a very, very early picture of Charlotte Baldwin and Augustus Allen. He and his brother, John Kirby Allen, were kind of in the real estate speculation business and not real sure why. Went to Texas and bought land early on Buffalo Bayou, which at the time was not much. It was a water tributary to get out to the Gulf of Mexico, but Buffalo Bayou became Houston, Texas. And they bought a little bit of land there when Houston was nothing. There were very few people living there, and they kind of made a bet and bought some land very cheaply on speculation and made a very, very good investment. You know, kind of tragically, the other thing I found out is people don't always leave for economic reasons. You know, Charlotte, this was the early 1800s. I think she lost 3 to 4 children in infancy, either due to miscarriage or illness or whatever. And I think she said in one of her statements that at that point they just decided to leave Baldwinsville and try something new. I think it must have been very tragic for the family. So, you know, Charlotte became a mover and a shaker. I'm kind of jumping ahead, but there's a new high-rise hotel in Houston, Texas. It's an independent, not part of any chain. I don't know how many stories tall it is. It's right in the center of Texas. Anyone know what the name of the hotel is? Brand new, just opened in early 2009. The C. Baldwin Hotel, and it's named after Charlotte Baldwin. So,
You know, she's called the mother of Houston.
she is called the mother of Houston, and some
You'll find a lot of information.
Some call her the co-founder of Houston. Yes. So there's been a little revisionist history. You know, men got all the credit for everything. We talked about this in the Carrie Downer presentation. During this century, women didn't have a lot of power, but Charlotte Baldwin Allen co-founded the city of Houston. And she is revered there. I mean, revered. There are schools named after her. There's a new high-rise hotel. And Augustus, I don't know what happened, who knows, took off around 1850, I want to say, left her with one daughter, and she ended up controlling all the real estate interests and helping to run that city. So, Baldwin daughter, done well, huh? This is what they found when they got there, right? So, not too long after they arrived, you had the Battle of San Jacinto, April 25th, 1834, where Santa Anna surrendered to Sam Houston and his troops. This was long after the Alamo, and this was it. This was Texas independence from Mexico, and Texas became an independent republic, and Sam Houston became president. Not a state. It wasn't a state till 1945. So it was a full-fledged, you know, they talk about 6 flags over Texas. 1845, excuse me. The Allens were kind of in the right place at the right time, this newly named capital. There's a rumor that goes around. Now, the 2 historians I talked about in Houston, they're not so sure this happened, but I've read it in 3 different books, that when they were sitting around after the Battle of San Jacinto, which is only 20 miles from Houston, and they were trying to figure out, what do we name our new capital? Because it hadn't been relocated to Austin yet. They wanted something proximate to where the battle had taken place. and she was having dinner with Sam Houston and happened to mention, gee, Houston would be a good name, which I'm sure Sam Houston was all for that, right, you know? Obviously, it's Austin now, and it had bounced around. There had been a couple of different towns that had been capitals as the revolution was taking place, but they settled on Houston, and for a few years, Houston actually was Texas's capital. What you see there in the top, you know, that's the former Capitol building right there, and that was sketched from the Allens' house by a cousin of Stephen Austin. So they were right there as Houston was being built, and at that time it had less than 3,000 inhabitants. Down below, they ended up transforming the Capitol building after the Capitol was moved to Austin. The Allens transformed the Capitol building in Houston to a hotel, and they did quite well, thank you very much. And they also owned thousands of acres in and around Houston, which can't be too bad for a city that's growing like that. Sam Houston's an interesting guy, not just because he wears a really cool hat. But I don't know. I think it's just a mark. But any idea how long the Battle of San Jacinto lasted? You think about the Battle of the Alamo, right? These guys were in there and they were under siege by the Mexican army, and they were suffering and they died horrible deaths, and it went on for days. Battle of San Jacinto, 18 minutes and it was over. Not exactly Mexico's finest hour. He was kind of an irascible guy, and he became the first president, but I think he still retained a lot of his frontier charm. He fell in love with a woman from Alabama. Her mother-in-law insisted not only that he travel to Alabama for the wedding to marry her daughter, because he was quite a bit older, but that he had to convert to be a Baptist. Now, I don't think Sam Houston had darkened the doors of a church ever in his life, but he agreed to convert and become a Baptist for this woman. And apparently, according to legend, when the preacher married them and would first baptize Sam with water and said, I now wash away all your sins, Sam Houston quipped, God help those poor fish. So I think Sam Houston had seen a lot and done a lot in his days on the frontier, and I think he continued to be a pretty wild spirit. I don't know that for a fact. Okay, so that was Charlotte. Now, a couple years later, Horace followed, and I have one of Charlotte wrote a letter to the Baldwinsville Gazette and Farmers Journal, if I can find it, and she describes the Houston they arrived at just a few years before Horace as a howling wilderness. It was a wild place. So Horace and Maria Wallace, again, he was a Baldwin son and followed his sister to Houston. They had 3 children, Julia Elizabeth, who's Libby, who's the focus of my presentation tonight. Jonas Cutler, you'll find the Baldwin genealogy is littered with men named Jonas Cutler Baldwin something, because they were all named after Jonas C. Baldwin, the founder. And then Charlotte Marie, named after her aunt. I know it's going to get confusing. Let's just focus on Libby for a while. Libby was 12 when they moved to Texas circa 1839. Okay? Less than 3,000 people in Houston. It's what you think it might have been like. This is the Capitol Hotel, probably the only decent frame structure in town. You can see longhorn cattle, horses and cowboys out front. And then this is, I like this engraving too. You know, they're coming down Buffalo Bayou in a steamboat shooting at alligators. So, yeah, exactly. So just like another day on the Seneca. But it was a pretty dangerous place to take your family to, clearly. And she was only 12 years old. And I have a feeling kids grew up pretty fast in that kind of environment. Interestingly enough, probably the most famous Baldwin child is Harvey. Anybody know his claim to fame? Bonnie, you can answer.
Syracuse.
First mayor of Syracuse, right. So he was a pretty enterprising guy and was involved in the Plank Road movement in central New York. Who's heard of the Plank Road movement? Do you know what plank roads were? Okay. Yeah, so I mean, roads were terrible, especially around here where they had to go through swampland and everything else. And so they laid down flat boards and logs to try to create some semblance of a roadway so people could travel them, especially before the railroads. We had one going, those two shown there are a plank road and a toll gate going from Syracuse to Salina. The most famous one went from Syracuse to Brewerton. And there's a park out there called the Plank Road Park, and you can read all about it. We had toll gates here in Baldwinsville too. There was one out West Genesee Road about where the 690 interchange is. So you had to pay a toll to travel on these plank roads. They weren't for free. And so Harvey Baldwin was down there pitching a plank road to a guy named William Marsh Rice, who was a railroad tycoon already at a very early age. Another one who had made a fortune in Texas pretty quickly. The thing I like most about Harvey Baldwin is not that he's a Baldwin or the first mayor of Syracuse, but I want a pair of those glasses. I think if I can get those glasses and Sam Houston's hat, the world will be my oyster. Anyone knows where I can get these things, please let me know.
Is there any other picture of him besides that one? I've never seen one.
Don't know. This is an official portrait that's now at the Onondaga Historical Association.
No, I've never seen any other
Right.
one than the one with the glass.
By the way, there are 2 6 by 8 foot portraits of Jonas and Betsy C. Baldwin in the Onondaga Historical Association. I got to be careful what I say on camera. They belong to the village of Baldwinsville. They're beautiful. They're huge. They were gifted to Beeville. They did appear in the, some of you may remember, they were in the Seneca Federal Building at one time, some 50 years ago. And they found their way to the OHA and don't know if we'll ever get them back. So
We did find out that they are there.
they are there. There's one of Stephen Baldwin, too, that I don't think anybody's ever seen, that we can't seem to put our hands on.
Just to comment on the plank road, did you know that it was only 1 lane wide?
Did not know that.
And so the southbound traffic from the north into Salina was, they could use the plank road, but going home, they had to use the mud.
You just never go home, right?
And the reason was that the wagons were heavy, loaded with
Ah,
vegetables.
okay, right.
Coming to market,
And then lighter on the way back.
and then later on the way back.
I did not know that. Thank you for adding that. That's why it's important for everyone to speak up. Yeah. No, I imagine that made sense. So here we have our first picture of Libby Baldwin. And by this time, she had married a man named John Brown, gone to California. Not much is known about that, and had already been widowed. And beautiful woman, right? And the Baldwins were movers and shakers like the Allens in Houston at this time. So Horace, her father, the guy I just showed a picture of a minute ago, ended up becoming the 7th mayor of Houston. Okay, so her aunt and uncle founded Houston. Her father became mayor sometime later. She was in, in high society, and so she met Rice. Rice was a widower at this point too, and was the richest man in Texas. So I'd say Libby did pretty well for herself, and he only got richer. As they married, I'm kind of jumping ahead because the real juicy part comes later. But they had an apartment in New York City. They had a whole floor of the Capitol Hotel in downtown Houston, and they had an estate in rural New Jersey that they built from scratch. Hundreds of acres of farms, outbuilding barns. This is about the best picture we can find of it. But according to the locals at the time, this was a big deal. Nobody lived like this. It was a small farming community. Marsh fancied himself kind of a plantation owner, but didn't like the heat of Houston in the summer. So they would shuffle back and forth between Houston, New York, and New Jersey, and this is what they built up there. About this time, and I'm trying to put dates up in the corner, but they're not showing up. This is 1891. Who's heard of the Cooper Union in New York City? Pretty interesting place. Peter Cooper was a philanthropist and really a free thinker and ahead of his time. And his concept, and we're talking 1859, I think, his concept was that the children of working families should be able to go to an institution of higher learning tuition free because they'd never be able to afford it. And if they didn't go, then all we were going to do was, continue this class system in America that was starting to evolve. And so he had a kind of a unique idea, and it took off. And a lot of people of no means were educated there, and he did a lot of good. The other interesting thing about the Cooper Union is that an unknown senator from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln made probably his defining speech of his 1860 campaign there, railing against slavery And that's when he really he kind of solidified his reputation as an abolitionist. So Cooper Union has always been known as a very free-thinking, forward-thinking, progressive establishment of higher learning for people. Rice saw this, and you know, I have mixed feelings about this guy, as you'll see as we go on. He did have, you know, occasional glimpses of charity and philanthropy, if I can say that. And he thought, you know, this would be good to have in Houston because they were a little envious that the East had Ivy League universities, land-grant colleges. They didn't have anything like that in Houston, and he wanted to establish something similar. So in 1891, he created a charter, and I have it right here if anybody's really interested in reading it, where he kind of lays out exactly what Peter Cooper's vision had been, to try to create an institute of higher learning in Houston that would follow the principles of Peter Cooper, called the Marsh Institute of blah, 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 blah. I don't remember the full name, but there's the charter right there. This becomes very important in this case because in Marsh's mind, he had no children, and he didn't have very many nieces and nephews, and he felt like he wanted to do something with his money that was big. I think it was as much about helping people as about having William Marsh Rice, right, on the building like Peter Cooper did, and going down in posterity as somebody who'd done something big and life-changing. They kind of bounced back and forth, as I said. They spent their winters entertaining in the newly acquired Capitol Hotel. He bought that, and they took a whole floor and decided to take rooms there, and they lived there, and Libby entertained lavishly. There it is shown in about 1905, and there she is a little bit later in life. But there seems to be some kind of a split here where Rice was a difficult guy, and let's face it, in the 1890s, like Vanderbilt and Morgan and Rockefeller and Frick and some of the other barons, if you will, of industry, you don't get where you are in that era by being benevolent and kind and charitable. So there's some interesting things from his past that are not in this presentation that I think allowed him to make the kind of money that he did. But he was very unilaterally focused, other than the Institute, on making money and on conducting commerce. Libby, on the other hand, wanted to entertain, throw parties, host things. So they really lived two different lives, and they split their time between Houston, New Jersey, and New York. That's another bone of contention here too, because later on you're going to find out where they actually lived, where they were residents, would dictate the status of this whole bequest that she made to Baldwinsville. Kind of interesting, I don't know why I put this in here, but there's Jefferson Davis and his wife, Verena. You know who Jefferson Davis was, right? So in the last days of the Confederacy, right before the war ended, they had a love child. And it kind of invigorated the Confederacy. Like, people saw this as some kind of sign of hope that maybe the Confederacy had a rebirth and was going to do well, and that this wouldn't become a lost cause. So Winnie Davis became kind of this symbol that got paraded around the South as somebody representing the lost cause. She was known as the daughter of the Confederacy long after the Civil War was over, and parades would be given in her honor, and she traveled around and around, and she was just dearly loved throughout the South. Wherever she went, Mobile, Houston, Atlanta, you name it, she made the rounds, and every good Confederate lad wanted to marry Winnie Davis. So Winnie Davis, made a sojourn to upstate New York, and decided to visit some family friends. This was obviously long after the war, and made the mistake of falling in love with a guy from Syracuse named Fred Wilkinson. So when she returned south, engaged to a Yankee, they weren't so welcoming of Winnie. Winnie wasn't able to make the rounds as much as she used to, because now she was engaged to one of these guys that helped to forge the War of Northern Aggression. Incidentally, his grandfather probably was one of the most well-known abolitionists of the day too, which certainly didn't endear him to the people of the South. Anyway, one of the last things she did in 1895 was host the Daughter of the Confederacy in Houston. It was a huge deal. Everybody was there. There were parades. Veterans of the Confederacy were marching, and it was a huge deal. This is important because in 1895 to 96, what I've come to find is, if anything, Libby accelerated her social calendar. She was chairing committees, she was hosting big events, and she was hosting people like, very well-known people like Winnie Davis. That comes up a little bit later too, because in my mind around this time, she was sharp as a tack. She knew exactly what she was doing. I think she did that when she married Marsh too. And let's face it, when you're 20 years older than a woman and you've got lots of money and she doesn't, you got to kind of go into things with clear eyes, right? Everybody's getting something. So, okay, so what happens? So in 1896, at the height of the social season, Libby suffers a stroke. Now, it doesn't seem, from what I've read, to be a big deal. All right, it was a minor stroke, and for some strange reason, after they'd been wintering in Houston and summering in New York, in May, he brought Libby back to Houston, which kind of makes me wonder a little bit right there. Why? That's kind of like a reverse commute, because Houston in the summertime, has anybody been to Houston in the summer?
Yeah.
It's bad with air conditioning, so think about what it must have been like in 1895. So he hauls her all the way back to Houston so that local doctors can attend to her. After a very short period of time, he takes her to a place called Waukesha, Wisconsin, to take the waters, which was code for somebody's got a problem and we need to institutionalize them. She stayed at the Park Hotel, which later became the Still Rock Spa, known for its springs, and that's where people took the waters and got better. You can see a later ad for it down below, especially good for people with diabetes and Bright's disease. So at the time, I'm not sure why he took her there for a stroke, but he did. So he takes her to Waukesha. She's got a doctor and a nurse from Houston. He stays a little while, and what does he do? He books for New York. Leaves her there. She's all alone. Fires her doctor, fires her nurse, and puts her in the charge of a local doctor she doesn't know, no family, no friends, in the Still Rock Spa, which sounds great unless you can't leave, and doesn't know anybody. So here we go. You know, sadly, July 25th, 1896, this came out in Houston. She died alone in Waukesha, Wisconsin. You read it, it's kind of tragic, right? This woman was not that old and seemed to be at the height of social status, entertaining, all the things that made Libby's life worth living. She seemed to be doing quite well in Houston until she got hauled off to Waukesha. Nothing against Waukesha. I've never been there. I'm sure it's very nice. Now you look, is it Waukesha? Waukesha. Clearly, I've never been there. So, apologies to the folks from Waukesha. I'm sure they're going to be watching this on YouTube tomorrow night. Now, this is where it gets a little dicey. So, in the article from Houston that announces her death, her condition was very critical when she left home, but she improved afterward, and last week a letter was received here by a friend from her saying she expected to get well. Okay, that's good to know. Mr. and Mrs. Rice made Houston their home in the winter and New York in the summer. The body will likely be brought here in the fall and laid beside those of her father and mother. That's reasonable to expect. So here we are, it's July 1896. They're going to wait till fall, bring her body back, reinter her, which would be the responsibility of whom? Husband. They're still married, even though he's hanging out in New York. Then you look over here and it says, after the war, she was married to Mr. William Rice, who was in New York at the time of his wife's death. So things are starting to look a little, I don't know. I don't like the looks of it.
When did she go in?
She left, she went up to Waukesha in June of 1896 and died in July. She was only there 6 weeks. Young, vibrant woman in the flower of her youth.
So where is she buried?
You're jumping way ahead of me here. Good question. I'm just not ready to answer it yet. So that's Libby Baldwin Rice. I mean, she was a granddaughter of our two founders, right? She's part of the Texas branch of the Baldwin family. Has anybody ever heard of her before? No. She did some pretty big things. Her aunt was the co-founder of Houston. She married the wealthiest man in Texas at the time of her death. Some consider that he was one of the top 10 wealthiest men in the country. This guy was filthy rich, okay? And along with wealth comes what? Power. Thank you. Well, let's shift gears a little bit. What was Libby's intent? What did Libby want to do? She remembered her Baldwinsville roots. She still had cousins here. A lot of the cousins were now in New York City, Cleveland, Ohio. Harvey's family was in Syracuse and points beyond. But she still had cousins here and remembered, had fond memories of Baldwinsville. So one of the things she did, which her husband was none too pleased about, was she left a will, a secret will, that she wrote some weeks before her death, which was news to William Marsh Rice, who thought they had kind of an understanding that all the money, when either one of them passed, would go to his institute, right? His William Rice Institute. This came as quite a shock. You can see his picture there. He doesn't look like a happy guy at all. I don't think he was happy ever, because I can't find a good picture of him. But anyway, you look in here and it says, and this is where it gets interesting, because I'd never heard of this before till I read Hawley's book. For the purpose of erecting a home for indigent gentlemen and women, we got cut out of this at some point, but it was for men too, at Baldwinsville, New York, to be known as the Elizabeth Baldwin Home. She left a certain amount of money. For the purpose of purchasing a park within the limits of Houston, to be known as the Elizabeth Baldwin Park, a fountain in honor of her aunt. Now, I added all this up, and I've got her actual will right here. Call me anal retentive if you want. It adds up to over $1.1 million. Now, if you want to translate that to 2020 dollars, anybody know what that factor would be? 33, right. So she left the equivalent of $33 million in 1896, mostly to cousins, friends, family in Houston and in Baldwinsville, New York City, but also $250,000 for a home for old folks here in Baldwinsville. And she gets very specific about what that home is meant to be and what it's supposed to do. Rice was apoplectic, right? Because he claims they never discussed it, and I'm sure they didn't, but she had her wishes. And in her mind, they live in Texas, which was a community property state. Thank goodness I've got my brother who's a lawyer right here to keep me honest. But New York was a common law state, and in a community property state, you have the right to leave half of the collective estate to pretty much whomever you want. Am I pretty close? He's nodding yes. In New York, on the other hand, it would revert to Rice for the most part. Right? Yep. Thank you. Don't forget the 20 I gave you before the... So let's talk a little bit more about what she had in mind. I'm going to read this. It's my desire to erect a home in my memory in Baldwinsville, state of New York, to be given as a home for indigent gentlewomen, and to be called and known as the Elizabeth Baldwin Home. It is to be located and situated in this town of Baldwinsville, state of New York, and I desire to purchase what is known as the Old Wallace Homestead, if the same can be purchased for a reasonable price. She names two of her cousins, Stephen Baldwin and Frank Baldwin. Stephen lived in New York City, Frank in Baldwinsville, and she left $250,000. Again, you can see the exchange rate, not the exchange rate, but that's $8 million in today's money. What could $8 million do for the community of Baldwinsville? Now, we have here Syracuse Home and McCary Life, but this would have been a pretty significant boon, number one, to the economy, but also to people who may have been living on the margin at the time. Okay. Anyway, so we move on. Her inspiration, I told you, Rice had an inspiration in the Cooper Union and Peter Cooper. She had her own inspiration. There was a guy named W.W. Corcoran who was a philanthropist in D.C. She references him directly and says she wants this home to be like Corcoran's Louise home in Washington. This is a guy who, like Cooper, was progressive, pretty far thinking. He established a home in, I don't know exactly when, it's shown there about 1885, mid-century. And it was really, again, for people that had no means and were at the end of their life and they had no family to care for them, primarily women. He'd lost daughters and his wife early in life and had a soft spot for women and wanted to make sure that he could provide for them. And she saw this and thought, what a great idea, I'll do the same thing in Baldwinsville. Pretty honorable, noble endeavor. The site she wanted to buy was her Uncle Silas Wallace's home. Now, Silas had married her aunt, who was a Baldwin. The Baldwin mansion, I mean the Wallace mansion, was out on Salinas Street. If you go over, that's Salinas Street. This is the VFW. I don't know what that is. And there's the railroad tracks, and it was right there.
Right about where Doughboys is.
Yeah, just this side of that. So about 6 acres with a huge mansion on it. She had the place all picked out, had family connections, and had set aside $100,000 just to buy the property, which would have been more than enough in those years. I went past there a little while ago. There's an old photo, thanks to Bonnie's. Who reads History Mystery in the Messenger? Yeah, okay, thanks to Bonnie. This was one of those history mysteries. There's the Wallace Mansion right there. There's no real good picture of it, but you can see it's huge, lots of columns in the front. This house is still there. I might be mistaken. I think it's 56 Salina, but you'll see it, and everybody knows what this is, right? What is it? Barnes Dairy. When I was growing up, it was the only place in town you could get an ice cream cone. And so that building's still across the street. So if you really can't find the house, look for Barnes Dairy, and it's across the road. Okay, so that's what Libby tried to do. I think it was a really noble exercise. She tried to leave money to make Baldwinsville a better place. I think we'd all agree that's a good thing to do. Everybody thinks so, except her husband. Not so good an idea. So what happened to kind of prevent her dream from coming to fruition? This is where it gets really complicated. I'll try to move through it quickly. But he aggressively fought Libby's lawyer in court for 4 years. Now, his lawyer was a guy named James Addison Baker, James A. Baker the First. James Baker, James A. Baker. Sound familiar? Anybody know? Secretary. His grandson was Secretary of State during the Bush administration. So a pretty connected lawyer. Her lawyer was Orrin Thaddeus Holt, who became a mayor of Houston, and some accused him of kind of being underhanded about this whole thing because at the time his fee for doing this was 10% of whatever she could collect from Marsh's estate, which is pretty significant and pretty unheard of at the time. The first thing they tried to do was say she was non-compos mentis, that she was out of her mind and mentally imbalanced. I've read the depositions from the transcripts. There were over 2 dozen witnesses that came in and said, this woman was sharp as a tack. Yeah, she'd had a stroke. She had a little paralysis in her face and on one side of her body, but the woman had it together. So that didn't fly in court at all. The next attempt was, where was their official residence? I mentioned that before. New York was a common law state, so Marsh was trying to insist they'd always lived in New York since they were married in 1867, which is kind of unusual for a man that had over 1 million acres in Texas, had a floor at the Capitol Hotel in Houston, was the president of 3 different companies all based in Houston, and spent at least 9 months a year in Houston. So, you know, it was a little stretch of the imagination to try to make that claim. Libby, of course, said they lived in Texas, it was a community property state, and that she should be able to bequeath up to 50% of the estate to whomever she wanted. This goes back and forth for 4 years, and then something interesting happens. So this guy on the left, Patrick, was hired by Libby's lawyer, Orrin Holt, to go up and take all these depositions and find out what was really going on in New York City. Did they really live there? How did he treat her? How much money was really available? So he was acting on behalf of Libby's estate while he was in New York investigating the case. The guy on the right was Charles F. Jones. He was, however you want to pronounce it, valet or valet to Rice, who by this time was a pretty eccentric guy and needed someone to kind of watch over him because he did strange things. For instance, his form of exercise was rolling himself in a rug and then rolling repeatedly across the living room floor. That's how he got his exercise. He ate only 2 things. He ate eggs and he ate granola, and that was it. So probably not somebody you want to spend a lot of time with in close confines. But anyway, that was all he ate. He had an entire floor in the Berkshire Apartments at Madison Avenue. Again, you're talking about a guy who $5 million probably in 1900, which is $150 million today or something close to it. Very, very wealthy man. Well, these 2 guys, Patrick actually, unbeknownst to a lot of people, had been disbarred in Texas. Didn't bother to tell anybody that when he went to New York to work for Libby's estate, but he ended up being on both sides of the same case, which is probably not done, I'm thinking. And was able to kind of get in the good graces of Jones, Marsh's valet or valet, and persuaded Jones it might be a good idea for Jones to share all the documents that Rice was signing with Patrick, just so he could review them and have insight into what Marsh's finances were. So not only was he reviewing all of Marsh's documents, he was becoming very practiced at duplicating Marsh's signature on things, which always leads to bad things. So something else hit, and in addition to a bunch of other books here, I've got, I'm a big fan of Eric Larson. I've read everything he's ever written. Anybody ever read Isaac's Storm? Great book.
I did.
Okay. About the most devastating hurricane that hit Houston and Galveston, really. 1900, September 20-something, 1900, right at the time this was all coming to fruition. So it wiped out the island of Galveston, completely gone, not a building standing, 10,000 people killed, and did significant damage to a lot of Marsh's holdings in Houston as well. He's actually mentioned in this book as this being kind of the catalyst that did him in. So he had one mill that got completely wiped out in a fire following the hurricane, and he had to wire $400,000 quickly to Houston, which even for a rich guy, that's a lot of liquid capital to have. It pretty much depleted whatever cash he had on hand in the bank. Well, who do you think found out that all of a sudden $400,000 was going to go south? Patrick and Jones, right? So they said, uh-oh, this guy's getting ready to deplete his bank account. Maybe we should move quickly. So what did they do? Moving fast, they started to forge some rather large checks and go in and try to cash them. Now, these guys are bright, and they figured out Marsh's signature, but they're not really that bright, because how in the world, if you're a forger, do you get your victim's name exactly right, but you misspell your own? I've heard from some lawyers, I won't mention any, that they aren't always the brightest people in the world, but Patrick was in such a hurry to duplicate Marsh's signature exactly, and I'm oversimplifying here, that he misspelled his own name. And so when Jones, the valet, presented the check to Swenson Bank to collect the $25,000, and there were probably 5 or 6 of these checks for $25,000, and they were all in a big hurry to do this before the money went to Houston, the banker noticed that the name wasn't correct, and so Albert Patrick came back into the bank and said, "Oh, I made a mistake. Let me make out another one." So he left and came back 20 minutes later with another check from Rice for another $25,000. At that point, the banker said, no, we're not going to do this. And he wired Rice's attorneys in Houston and said, you need to look into this. There's somebody up here trying to cash a lot of checks, and he can't even spell his own name right. That's not the worst of it. The next day, they actually found out, well, Rice was dead. So that complicated things too. So not only when they got Jones in the bank and confronted him and said, these checks are bad, we're not going to cash them, we're going to hold them until Rice's attorney arrives from Houston, Jones broke down and said, well, actually, Rice is dead, and that's why we need to cash these checks right away. Which, again, raised even more suspicions. Like, instead of saying, geez, maybe we ought to just forget this and take off, right? Get out. No, he doubled down and said, well, Rice just died this morning, so we really need to cash these checks. So what happens? Well, Attorney Baker wisely said, hold everything, don't cash any checks, and for God's sake, don't have Rice's body cremated till we figure out what did him in, because we suspect some things. Anyway, come to find out, Patrick and Jones had a lot more to worry about than just a forged check. They forged the checks, which is bad enough, to the tune of over $200,000. Again, a lot of money. A forged will. They forged Rice's will. Now, this is the gall that this guy had, this Patrick. So he misspells his name on the check, goes away, corrects it, comes back with another check for $25,000. Then they spill the beans that, well, actually Rice is dead, so we really need to get the money quickly. And then, come to find out, before he's arrested for murder, he comes out and says, there's a new will. And even though he was on Libby's side of the estate, he wasn't working for Rice. He somehow managed to say, Well, Rice, in a moment of weakness, decided to will all of his assets to me. Pretty bold. So you're accused of forging checks. Now you've got a forged will that says Rice didn't even really know this guy, right? And he was really upset that he might have to give money to his wife's heirs and legatees. He's going to give $4 million or $5 million to this attorney he's not even ever met, right? So this thing got really, really squirrely, and it became the case of the century, right at the end of the century. It went from there, and you know, it became very sensationalized. You can see some of the things that were suggested. Maybe they hypnotized him, murder by hypnotism. You can see it in his eyes, right? That's always a good forensic tool to use, is what do their eyes look like? It didn't bode well for Patrick or Jones. I think, you know, this is a case of the butler actually did do it. Jones did do it. He chloroformed Rice, but Patrick was the mastermind behind the whole thing. Jones was very young, very impressionable. He was from the Midwest. He really hadn't been around much. Patrick was a disbarred lawyer who forged checks, forged a will, and I think he really was recognized as the mastermind. So Libby's will, unfortunately, this is still going on, right? Libby's heirs are going, come on, where's the money? Where's the home for the indigent gentlewomen? But this thing has to play out. They had to wait till the end of the murder trial. I'm cutting through a lot of, this takes months, and it's a great trial testimony to read. But Patrick was convicted and sentenced to death in 1902. He went to Sing Sing and served 4 years where, you know, some people just never give up. He became the mayor of Death Row, which I think is a, you know, I'm always looking for things to put on my resume. Mayor of Death Row at Sing Sing. He did well for himself. Again, some people just get away with a lot. He got his sentence commuted to life, and then a few years later he got pardoned and released. So he was the mastermind behind the murder of probably one of the wealthiest men in the country at the time. Very bad intent in so many ways, and he was released in 1912 after serving just a couple of years. Jones, unfortunately, well, he testified against Patrick. He clearly was very impressionable. I don't think he had a free will of any kind, and unfortunately he moved away and ended up doing himself in later in life. He just couldn't deal with what had happened. It's kind of tragic too. A lot of tragedy in this story. I was able to track down the actual settlements in the Houston archives of Libby's heirs. It's interesting, some of them held out for more money, some of them caved and took money right away. The Home for Indigent Gentlewomen was represented by trustees Stephen Baldwin of New York City and Frank Baldwin of Baldwinsville, and they ended up finally in 1902. These are quit claims. What they said is anything that's out there that still hasn't been settled in terms of Rice's estate, because it was massive. I mean, even by 1902, they still hadn't unraveled his network of lands and holdings. Millions of acres in Texas, Louisiana. They basically said we're giving up any claim on any of his property, anything of value in exchange for $30,000. Now, I just found this yesterday, but I don't know where the $30,000 went. Trustees are supposed to act in behalf of the institution that they're representing. We all know that. So I'm not one to cast aspersion on Baldwin descendants, but I don't think anyone saw the $30,000. It certainly didn't go into a home or anything else. It kind of disappeared. I have a feeling Stephen and Frank know exactly where it went. So that's the status of the Home for Indigent Gentlewomen. The other thing that Libby tried to do, and this one was successful, is she did want to have a park created in Houston in her honor. It's there today. You can go see it. It's a beautiful park. It's about 5 acres in the center of Houston. This is the original plan that was presented in the paper in 1912. There is no lake, but beautiful grounds. And it's kind of like a garden spot for the center of Houston. And I'm really glad it has her name on it, okay? So $10,000 was settled out of his estate to buy the land. The city of Houston bought it for $10 and put a park there, and it's named in her honor. She did stipulate that in the center of the park there had to be a fountain in honor of her aunt, and it's there. So she honored her aunt, the one that was the co-founder of Houston, Texas. So I guess part of her wishes came true. We didn't get a park or a home, but we should be happy that something got done. Rice went on to fame in death. His institute did open. It's called Rice University. Largest private institution of its kind at the time west of the Mississippi River. Huge institution, enormous endowment thanks to his $5 million endowment. And it opened its doors in 1912, and his name is all over it. He's kind of revered down there. They built a statue in his honor in the center of campus. They reinterred his ashes underneath the statue, and here you can see the ceremony where they did that in 1930. So if you wonder where Libby's $250,000 that was supposed to go for a home in Baldwinsville went, send your kids to Rice University, your grandkids or whatever. That's where the money is. So I guess what kind of bothers me, all right, is, again, like Carrie Downer in the last presentation, not a lot of power, not a lot of influence, a woman who tried to kind of make her way. I think Libby's, in a different way, kind of tried to do some of the same things. I think she tried the best to do what she could do. Rice has kind of become deified in Houston for the reason that $5 million went to create Rice University, enormous boon to the economy. A lot of money went to Houston, and a lot of people benefited from that money more than just the university. It went to other heirs and other things. This is kind of what bothers me. This is a photograph of Rice taken around the time of his dispute with his wife over the will. Not a happy-looking guy, all right? And this is the official portrait of Rice, which was allegedly made from this photograph. Now, you tell me. I want that guy to do my portrait because, Rice was irascible, eccentric, miserly, and I'm not making this stuff up. This comes from contemporary accounts. He was a baron of industry. He didn't get where he was by being a nice guy. He did bequeath a lot of money to a university, but he wasn't exactly a nice guy. And now they've got him with rosy cheeks and eyes gazing toward the heavens, and he's become some kind of a martyr and a saint. And I just think, let's recognize him for what he did. He created Rice University, but there's some things he did that probably weren't very savory, and I just don't like that portrait. So in my house, this is the portrait I have of Rice right there. I think of Libby Baldwin. That's what I think of. And I said there were only 3 questions, but we'll have a bonus, and I know we're shutting down here, so refreshments are not far away. But what really happened between Rice and Libby leading up to her death? There's been a fair amount written about this. I mean, there's a whole book if you want to read exactly what happened in the trial of these knuckleheads who couldn't spell their name. The trial of the death of Old Man Rice is in detail what happened. James Baker, his attorney, there's a biography of him which covers a lot of this stuff in detail. Those are pretty, I think, objective. And then you have this, which was put out by Rice University. And I know you're watching, because they said they would, and they've been very helpful, and I really do appreciate that, but this is bullshit. I'm sorry, but this came out in 1949 as like a master's thesis. It was updated in the 50s and updated in the 70s. And you read this, and you'd believe the portrait, right? And it really make Libby look bad. The worst part is they don't tell the truth. If you read the newspaper accounts about Libby, who she was, what she did, and what their relationship was, it's not what's written here. And I'm just going to raise a few points, if you'll bear with me. It's small type, so I'll read it to you. One source said there's considerable mystery surrounding the final weeks of Libby Rice's life. I would believe that. A cousin said the death of my cousin was so suspicious that I tried to do some investigating. I learned little about the case. Consider these points, okay, one by one. One source whose mother knew Rice said he was just the meanest thing. It was no wonder he was murdered. Another one who knew her said her married life was never very happy. Her husband was so peculiar. Another, I could have been accused of that. Another said, I don't know what the tenor of the marriage was during the first years, but during the 1890s it was stormy. For some time after 1892, Libby consulted an attorney and they named him about a divorce. Not mentioned here. Within 2 weeks of executing her new will, Rice had her moved from Houston to Waukesha. Thank you very much. Within 6 weeks of executing the new will, she was dead. Rice claimed he knew nothing of the new will until after her death. I find that a little hard to believe. Libby was first under the care of a Houston doctor and nurse whom she knew well and trusted. Okay, a Dr. Rutherford who'd cared for her most of her adult life. Rice fired them and hired a local guy, Dr. Wigginton, to replace them. Before he began treating her, Wigginton's claim to fame was he was the most recent superintendent of the Mendota Hospital for the Insane in Madison. One Rice Institute source, again in this book, claimed that she died hopelessly insane. Now, I've read all the testimony and the transcripts. Nobody in her family, nobody who knew her, said that she was insane. In fact, she was lucid and had a very sound mind right up until the very end. So this is just, it's slanderous at best. Rice later contested her will, saying that she was not mentally capable of knowing what she was doing. He said that her mind was much impaired, she gradually grew worse, she grew weaker in all respects, her mind was much enfeebled, and she was not herself at all, totally incapable of doing any business. Well, that was his job, right? She wasn't a business person. This position was destroyed by the depositions of dozens of witnesses, and the court agreed. Right after her death, Rice said that Libby's death was a painful surprise. A cousin said, none of her relatives or friends were with her when she died at Waukesha. Mr. Rice was here in New York and he did not go to her when she was ill. Neither did he attend her funeral. That same cousin, it's not up here, said he claimed he'd broken her leg and she saw him walking around just fine in Manhattan. This position was destroyed by the depositions of dozens of witnesses and the court agreed. I'm sorry, I've got to jump down. There's no record of Rice ever returning to Waukesha. So, you know, maybe they didn't like each other, maybe they had a bad marriage. They got married in 1867. She died in 1896. You're talking 30 years of marriage, and he wasn't with her when she died in Waukesha. And he had ample warning. Even in those days, you could take a train. There's no death certificate on file for Libby in any state, nor is there any record of her original burial location. Okay, I've looked, and people in Wisconsin have checked. There's no death certificate. Another cousin said, got that already. Despite having promised to bury her in Houston, this is where it really gets ugly. Rice ostensibly had her buried in Milwaukee under a plain headstone with the wrong birth year. It wasn't until 7 years later, in 1903, long after he was dead, that Libby's brother had her disinterred and reinterred in a Houston cemetery under two headstones, a new one with the correct birth year and the old one from Wisconsin, which he most likely relocated from Wisconsin to Texas. So Rice promised he was going to repatriate her remains to Houston in the fall. He had 4 more years to do it before he died. He left her in Waukesha under a headstone with the wrong birth year. Didn't tell anybody where she was. She got no visitors. Thankfully, Jonas Cutler Baldwin was able to write an epitaph for his sister. And this is kind of how I'd like to remember her. He said, and this was a quote from somebody who knew her in life, she was a brilliant woman. She moved and carried herself with the dignity, grace, and charm of a queen. She loved people and was always happiest when doing for others. So this is how I'd like to remember Libby Baldwin, and I suggest that we all do likewise. And on that, I think that's all about Libby Baldwin. Questions? Lessons? Never marry a millionaire, right? So we're pretty close to being up for time, but did anybody have any questions about any of this story? I mean, I think we have Syracuse Home and we have McCary Life, and I think that serves the needs of the community quite well. But it takes a lot of money, which is in short supply. Other questions? Great. Next one is, help me out, March 10th. Pardon me? Right, the last man to leave Picketville is, I think I told you about it at the beginning. It's going to be a great session. I hope you can make it. Thanks for coming tonight.
I also wanted to thank Bonnie and Martha for bringing the refreshments tonight. I forgot.